So we'll start by looking at Sanford's theory of challenge and support, and it's really kind of a simple concept. It is essentially to have growth, for a student to undergo growth, you have to have an appropriate balance of challenge and support. Too much of one or the other, and you will not see growth for different reasons, right? So if you have, if you're up here and you have more challenge than you do support, right? If your challenge is greater than your support, then what's going to end up happening there is that your students will end up becoming frustrated. They will have a lack of interest, which will lead to departure of some sort, whether that is that the student fails or the student withdraws from class, but you will have departure of some sort eventually. If you're on the other side of this line where you have more support than challenge, right? You have support is greater than the challenge. If that is the case, then students become complacent, right? They become content, and they view things as being easy, and they have this what I call learned helplessness. And again, they might be making good grades here, right? But they're not experiencing growth. So we don't want to have too much. We don't want to have too much of one or the other. So we want to have this kind of Goldilocks mentality of not too hot, not too cold, but just right for growth to occur. Then you have Arthur Chickering's 7 vectors. What Arthur Chickering did was basically to apply existing human growth and development theory in the higher education setting, which had not been done up to that point. And so the resulting vectors that you see here are really what he found that institutions of higher education provide in terms of development for their students. So we'll go through each one of these pretty briefly here and just kind of expound a little bit on each one of these 7 vectors. So the first vector is developing competence, that is intellectual competence, that is manual competence, and that is interpersonal competence. So intellectual, is the traditional, are we developing our students intellectually, cognitively? Manual is kind of your motor skills development, physical development, things of that nature. And then interpersonal is, are we developing our students in a social sense and helping them to learn how to navigate mature relationships. Then the second vector is managing emotions. So here we see our students begin to become aware of their emotions. They're aware of the significance of their emotions, and they begin to develop mechanisms to express themselves and express their emotions in mature and healthy ways. The third vector is moving from autonomy to interdependence. And so what you see here is that students begin to no longer need approval from external authorities, right? So they don't need anyone to tell them that what they're doing is okay or right or wrong. They don't need validation from other people. And then they get to this point where they don't need it, but they seek it anyway, but they seek it in appropriate ways, right? So we begin to seek out appropriate validation, right? There's nothing wrong with seeking out validation, but when you just kind of blindly seek out validation from other people for no reason other than you have no confidence in yourself, then that creates problems. So this movement from autonomy to interdependence is the ability of students to kind of see that, okay, it's okay to seek out validation, but there's appropriate ways to do that, and there are appropriate people in different contexts from which I need to seek validation. The fourth vector, you begin to develop these mature relationships, which we've kind of talked about a few times. Excuse me. The fifth vector, we start to begin to see the development of identity in terms of one's sexual orientation, their gender, their culture. They do this through feedback from their peers and others. And so they kind of experiment, with different with some different things, and then through the feedback that they get from their social settings, they kind of determine, who they want to be as a result of that feedback. So, this identity development is kind of largely dependent on the vectors preceding it, because these relationships that we have developed prior to developing our identity, right? If we're letting this feedback from our peers and our social settings kind of drive our identity development, then those relationships are very important in terms of who we are as a person. And so it's important that we develop this interdependence and that we develop good relationships before we are able to develop a mature identity and start to answer the question of who we are. The sixth vector is when we start thinking about what we want to do with our life in terms of our career, in terms of, do we want to start a family, do we want to be married, do we want to have kids, all of those sorts of things. And then the last vector is, once I've answered all these other questions and I know who I am and what I want to do, then how do I align that? How do I take my identity and align that with what is socially acceptable and with the values and the norms of society?